Okay, now I want to ask you, you wrote Hope on a Dying Planet 40 years ago, which was amazing. And I was wondering what got you interested in environmental concerns back in 1970?
A lot of people don't remember now that probably the peak of American interest in environmental concerns was around 1970. That was the time of the first Earth Day, and it was more of an event than any single occurrence since that time. It was a period in which we Americans, at least those of us who were sensitive to a wide range of issues, had become accustomed to being sort of startled by one thing after another. Probably the Vietnam War opened the doors in one respect, and the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King in another respect. But it was in the 60s that it became possible, and for some of us unavoidable, to see what was going on in the world and in our own country, and the basic policies of our own country in a radically critical light. Now, lots of things happened in the 60s that make it even painful to remember. I don't want to just celebrate the 60s, but my own feeling is that they were theologically and humanly and Christianly very important. And I, until late in the 60s, had, of course, some dislike of smog, and was upset by the fact that some of the trees on the mountains around here were dying. I don't mean I had no ecological interest, but I had no sense of any connection among them. They were just a few more problems to add to the long list of problems that we were concerned about. And it was in 1969 that one of my sons had me read a book by Paul Ehrlich, which was called The Population Bomb. Now, that's a book I don't really recommend to anybody now. It says lots of things that turn out not to be correct. But I am still very grateful to the book for having made me put together the various concerns and say, whoops, we are heading on a collision course with disaster. And once I had my eyes open to that, it changed my sense of what my own most important responsibilities were. And things that I would never have dreamed of dealing with in a classroom in theology before that time became important to me. So the first thing I did in terms of writing was a little book that's called Is It Too Late? I actually wrote that in 1969. It didn't get published till January of '72, but it was my desperate response to these questions. I tried to do other things, of course. I mean, but it wasn't as if I was alone in that. I'm saying this was a time when one could assume not that everybody would be interested, but that in almost every group, some people were interested. And at that time, the Southern California Council of Churches was open, and so I was at one point chair of a committee on Eco-Justice. It was the term that was most favored. I'm glad to say that whereas in the wider society often ecological concerns even swamped justice concerns, and I could understand that. I mean, it seemed so important to do something about the fate of the earth that matters of human justice seemed minor in comparison. So it was really the church's unwillingness to separate the two that kept me from probably going further than I ever did in that direction. Now, that committee simply in itself was a very minor factor, but it indicates the sorts of things that came into being. And I organized or participated with others, including this committee, in organizing 2 events. The first one we called the Theology of Survival. And it was a very small conference, but just because of this kind of public climate, and we had it before there was much else of a theological sort, it actually got written up briefly in Time magazine. Mm-hmm. Again, just to show the difference today, nothing, I mean, it wouldn't be noticed. It would also not have any importance. I'm not saying it had importance, but it just showed a kind of situation at that time. And then by far more thought and work went into a conference that we put on in 1972, which we called Alternatives to Catastrophe. And the people I got in contact with at that time are people who have been important to me for the nearly 40 years since that time. Of course, there were other people who came to the conference, and I think we had maybe 500 people came. It was, there were enough people who were looking for something all over Southern California. We met in the UCC church here in town. The 2 people who I became acquainted with at that time, one of them was Paolo Soleri. Soleri was planning cities that would not have any motor transport and would bring people together in much more intensive ways. I think would greatly reduce the difference between the lifestyle of the rich and the poor, but would be relatively self-sufficient. Their energy source would be purely the direct sunlight. And I think if people had built cities like that for the last 40 years, we'd be in a very different situation. So I think it was a good judgment to say that was an alternative to catastrophe. The other person I became acquainted with was Herman Daly, who's an economist who even then had been excommunicated by the Guild of Economists. I think that having as its goal growth of the economy is more a stronger commitment of the Economic Guild than worshiping God is a commitment of the Theological Guild. We'd already had the Death of God group and so forth, and Tom Altizer, though certainly criticized, and that's fine, was not really excommunicated. He could still be part of the group, but Herman Daly, his writings were simply not reviewed, and in fact references to him in the economic literature would not mention his name. We can call it erasure.
Blacklisted.